Welcome to a Listen to Learn episode of the Share Life podcast. I'm Jason Scott Montoya, and today I'm here with former university professor and Canadian, also American Christian David Koyzis. David, say hello.
Hello, how do you do?
You were born in the U.S., but you have dual citizenship, correct?
That's correct. Yes, that's right.
Okay. So do you travel back and forth a lot, or where's that?
Probably less than I used to.
Yeah.
I would go back to visit my parents, who are both gone now. I do have, all of my siblings live in the States, but they're
Okay.
scattered all over the place, and I don't get back as often as I might like. But yeah,
Well, do your Canadian friends often say, David, what the heck is going on in America?
oh yes, they do. They do. That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Well, you've been on the podcast before, one to talk about your book, Political Visions and Illusions, which is incredible. So I encourage those that have not gone and read the book or listened to the discussion to do that. You were also on the podcast, and we talked about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Crimea and who the land belonged to. Today, we're going to talk about the values required for someone to hold political leadership. So David has articulated 7 guidelines he shared after the January 6 hearings and has resurfaced in a recent blog post about America's current societal crisis in light of Trump's 34 felony convictions and the passionate continued support that people, particularly Republicans, continue to give him. So I wanted to start by just reading a section of this new blog post that you shared before we dive into the 7 items. And then we'll dive into those guidelines that you believe are just critical for anyone that we're trying to elect as a political leader, whether it's president or in lower offices as well. So I'm going to go ahead and read this passage and then get your thoughts on this to help set up the conversation we're about to have. You say, Trump famously boasted that he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and not lose votes. At the time, many people scoffed at such bluster, but since then, it appears that he was largely correct. 4 years later, his refusal to admit that he had lost an election led his followers to attempt violently to derail Congress' ratification of his opponent's victory. That virtually an entire political party support him unquestioningly, and that so many are willing to indulge his infantile ravings does not speak well of the health of our country's political institutions. So this sentiment is both something I've experienced as true in my interactions with Trump loyalists and also find deeply concerning and frustrating. Ronald Reagan famously said he never left the Democratic Party, but that the party left him. And that's how I feel as someone who kind of inherited Republicanism in my family and community, but have since felt abandoned since Trump came on the scene. So what's going on? What is a helpful framing before we dive into these requirements?
Yeah, I feel somewhat the same way. I was raised in a family just outside of Chicago that was largely Republican. As a matter of fact, the county where I grew up, DuPage County, Illinois, had a reputation of being one of the most Republican counties in the United States, apart from Orange County, California. And but then after I was older and was voting, I was much more likely to vote for the Democrats. But then the Democratic Party is not the same as what they were when I was younger. So in some ways I feel as though like Reagan, that the Democratic Party has left me behind as well. But then I don't feel like I can go back to the Republican Party in the state that it is in right now. In my next book, which is called Citizenship Without Illusions, the illusions in this title being an allusion to the illusions and political visions and illusions. But in the next book, I observe that the Democratic and Republican parties are diseased parodies of their former selves. And my editors didn't strike that. I kind of thought that is this too inflammatory? Will they not like that? But they left it in, and I'm persuaded of that. And part of it is because I'm an American citizen, but I've been living in Canada for most of the last 40 years, and so I'm looking at the United States as a semi-outsider, but not really an outsider. But it looks like a country quite different from the one that I left behind in the 1980s. A lot of things have changed. I think people have changed, the styles of leadership have changed. I think the criteria that that would probably that ought to be used before we're electing leaders have changed as well, and not for the better, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
And I think that's a phenomenon for both parties. So, and I want to make that clear to your listeners. The observations that I'm making today are not based in partisanship as well. I'm much more concerned with the health of the political system as a whole, and
Yeah.
with the political culture that supports it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's important because I think the values that we should hold them both towards ourselves and our own tribe, as well as rival political groups. We shouldn't cherry pick. Well, we'll hold them accountable, but we're not going to hold ourselves accountable. I think it should be both ways, right?
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's too much of this. My people may be bad, but yours are worse.
Yeah.
And there's too much that goes on. The so's your old man argument.
Yeah, which is frustrating as someone who in terms of the Republican history, in terms of my experience, there was so many things that they taught me about responsibility and leadership and not being passive, but actually being more of a courageous leader. And it's like as soon as power became at risk, those principles kind of went out the window. And that's part of how I feel. And I don't know if that's similar to your experience as well.
I think that's right. Yes.
Yeah. So I want to go through and just read the seven items so people can understand what it is we're talking about. And so these are 7 things you came up with of a would-be office holder. So someone that's running for a political office or some position of authority, particularly. But it can go from a local official all the way, city council, all the way up to, the president in terms of the American political system. So number 1 is a would-be office holder must respect the rule of law above his or her own ambitions. He or she must be loyal to the country's constitution and abide by its provisions, even to his or her own disadvantage. They must not abuse the office to advance personal, financial, or other interests. They must honorably concede to his or her successor when defeated in an election. I think that one's really important because I think we take that one so for granted.
Exactly.
But it's actually kind of a miracle that America has done so much of that. Number 5, we must refrain from divisive rhetoric and undertake, where possible, to unite the nation around a common task of doing public justice. Number 6, they must unwaveringly adhere to the truth and refrain from self-justification to cover missteps. And number 7, they must be generous and charitable to opponents and supporters alike. So talk to me about these 7 requirements, and are they in any particular order of priority, and where do they come from?
No, they're not in any particular order of priority. I guess I would sum them up by saying that a would-be political leader must have utmost integrity, and of course, nobody ever achieves perfection in any of these, but I think they are. I hate to call them ideals because ideals make the use of the term ideal makes it sound as though it's out of reach, which I don't think it is. But I think that there are ways in which we can our leaders can satisfy these, if not to 100%, at least to a very large degree. The rule of law. I think that's something that cannot necessarily be taken for granted. Russia has a very nice constitution, the Constitution of 1993 of the Russian Federation. It's an excellent document. In some ways, it's modeled after the French and the American constitutions in some ways, having a state president, but also having a prime minister and cabinet, very much like that of the French Fifth Republic from 1958 to the present time. But without a culture, a political culture that's supportive of the rule of law. And that's been a hard sell in Russia for centuries. I'm not just talking about the last 30 years or the last 100 years under the communists, but even going back to the Tsarist period, the idea of putting together a legal code or a legal system was always an uphill battle, and people were more likely to follow the customs of the local community or authorities where they
Yeah.
were living, but strong armed leaders have come to power in Russia. If somebody were to say to Vladimir Putin, "You're violating this, that, and the other provision of the Russian 1993 Constitution," he, like his Soviet predecessors, would simply say, would laugh in their face, or
Yeah.
simply ignore them. And that's not the thing that you want to see. So I suppose
Yeah.
the rule of law, I suppose that would have to be the very first in the
Yeah.
list, in terms of
Well, and
priority.
I think we're at a point where I think that's actually one of the underlying issues in terms of the populace and the non-populace is whether rule of law is the way to go. I think one of the arguments they might make is that our system is so dysfunctional that we have to discard the Constitution to get things done. Is sort of the simple version of that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very dangerous thing. But there's a moment of truth in it, in that the U.S. Constitution, the document that was negotiated by the founders in 1787, came into effect in 1789 when George Washington was inaugurated as the first president. That document is very difficult to change.
Mm-hmm.
And a document that is too rigid becomes brittle, and it's in danger of breaking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in many respects, the U.S. Constitution, I'm not talking about, there's a larger empirical constitution, small c constitution, that includes not just the document, but all the traditions and customs and the usages and practices that have grown up around it.
Yeah.
Those are the most flexible part of what I might call the unwritten American Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm using an expression that would be probably more familiar to Canadian constitutional scholars, because our system here in Canada, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet are nowhere mentioned in our Constitution Acts, but the Queen and the Governor General are mentioned. So in that you have all of these traditions and customs that have grown up around it. In the United States, I think something similar can be said, even though I don't think constitutional scholars are accustomed to speaking in that way. But because there's so much that is placed on the written Constitution, and because it's so very difficult to change, only a handful of amendments over the last 230 years. That presents a danger, because it tempts a Napoleonic figure to step in and try to break deadlocks or break the slowness of the way the system functions, to the detriment of the rule of law.
Yeah. Well, and you bring up an interesting point that I think is worth getting your thoughts on in terms of the Russian Constitution. Like, what we're seeing in Russia now is sort of this dictator that's taken control of things in spite of this Constitution. And I think a lot of people in our country sort of rest on that idea that, well, we have a Constitution and it'll hold if that person comes up. And I think what you're saying, you're trying to give an example. That's not always the case. So why should people, one, have confidence in it, but also not put so much confidence that it feels infallible either?
Yeah. Well, there's a real sense in which the American Constitution is not so much the document that the founders put together, but it's in the hearts of the people.
Mm-hmm.
And the founders themselves understood that. So the fact that many Americans will look back at their founders and they say, oh, they're geniuses, they set up a perfectly balanced system that couldn't possibly fail, that's not true. And the founders themselves knew that. If there's a genius of the American Constitution, it's that Americans have lived under this particular document for more than 200 years, which can't be said of anybody else in the world. Here in Canada, we've had our Constitution Act 1867 used to be called the British North America Act. It's 1867. That's 157 years ago now. And then the Constitution Act 1982, that's the newest part of our Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and so forth. In terms of living under those documents, we don't have as long a history as Americans do of living under the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I guess then, so you're talking about, what you're saying is the people, the people that operate in that constitution are key. And so if we become the type of
exactly.
people that become tyrannical, then it
Yeah.
doesn't matter what the constitution is because we'll just run all over it or discard it or whatever. Is that what you're
Oh,
saying?
Jason, absolutely. Oh my, yeah, you've put it exactly the right way. If a paper document, I used to teach European politics, and I used one textbook that talked about France, and of course France went through a series of regimes between 1789 and 1958. When the Fifth Republic was established. And during a lot of that history, French paper constitutions were, as the author of this particular chapter put it, periodical literature.
Yeah.
It's like you get a magazine, it comes into the house, you read it for a while, and then you throw it out, because it's not not relevant anymore. And Americans have lived under the U.S. Constitution, that document, for a very long time. Uh, Changing it probably not as much as it needs to change, and in many respects, the Supreme Court has had to step in and make changes irrespective of what is written in the Constitution itself.
Hmm.
And that, of course, has antagonized, and rightly so, many Americans. Like
Yeah.
the Roe versus Wade decision. Um, there were many people in 1973 when the Roe versus Wade decision, that's the one that legalized abortion and declared that a woman had a right to an abortion, that there were many legal scholars at the time who had no strong opinions one way or the other on the abortion issue, who believed that the case was very badly decided
Mm.
because it was
Yeah.
not based on what was written in the Constitution. It was based
Yeah.
on what the justices were trying to find
Mm.
uh, between the lines of the Constitution. And of
Yeah.
course, now 2 years ago, after the current Supreme Court invalidated Roe versus Wade in the Dobbs versus Jackson ruling, that's created a lot of trouble as well. Whether
Yeah.
it was a wise ruling, many people have different opinions on that, but I think most of the damage was already done half a century ago.
Yeah. Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense. And I think, and that it almost seems to be continuing in the last 8 years, and in several key cases that have come out in different ways.
Right.
Um, and I don't know how much they think of it, but it does definitely feels like, man, every ruling we come out, half the country is going to
Yeah.
hate us and half's going to love it, and
Yeah.
and regardless of the decision we make, and then
Yeah.
you also kind of think, well, what are they really making their decisions based on? And
That's right. Yeah.
it's confusing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I guess getting back to what I was saying before, I think the 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 Constitution is really something that exists within the hearts of the people.
Yeah.
And if people start to disrespect the paper Constitution, what will take its place? And I don't
Hmm.
think that's particularly clear in the minds of most Americans.
Yeah, and I think one other layer I would add to that I've been reflecting on is the former Justice Scalia talked about the
Right.
difference between parchment guarantees in the Constitution, like you were talking about, just
Yes.
they're just written, and then true structural things, separations of power, for example, federalism, where the
That's right.
power is actually distributed in a real way. And
That's right. Yeah.
so, um, a lot of my concerns, particularly with Trump's 2020 election lies and his attempts to stay in power, were an attempt to consolidate power, to overrule the state's power and overrule Congress's power, to consolidate it into his role so that he could get what he wanted. And I think that actually is more of a threat than maybe the. Often we look at January 6th and the violence, which was horrible, but I think that core issue of consolidation of power is kind of more fundamentally concerning, as far as I can tell.
It is that's right, but that's been going on for a very long time. Under both progressive and conservative
Hmm.
leaders.
Yeah.
The executive orders and so forth that
Hmm.
have gone out from presidents. It doesn't matter whether they're Democrats or Republicans. So the consolidation of power in the hands of the president is something that has gone on. Um, Probably in the first half of the 20th century, more by Democratic presidents than by
Hmm.
Republican presidents.
Yeah.
You had Woodrow Wilson. Well, Theodore Roosevelt, I think, was part of that as well. He was a Republican. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat, and of course, he was faced with the First World War and
Yeah.
the issues of that. And of course, wars tend to consolidate power in the hands of of single
Yeah.
leaders as well, or at least a small group of people.
Yeah. And more people are
Frankly,
willing to go with it. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, they almost have to, because it's a kind of emergency powers type of an assumption, and every political system has something like the assumption of emergency powers. We saw that during the COVID pandemic just a few years ago, when governments, Canada and the United States, both, people complained about it, but during times of emergency, whether it's a health emergency or war or a depression or what have you, governments take on powers that they would not ordinarily take under normal circumstances.
Yeah. Now, this list, you, as far as I remember, you published this after the January 6th hearings. Is this a list you had before
That's
that, or did you come up with it then?
um, I can't quite remember. I think I probably came up with it on the spur of the moment. I think, but a lot has happened since then, so I have to.
But
But yeah, I was trying to weigh in my own mind as to what makes for good leadership, and and I think there are probably other criteria. Maybe we could consolidate some of these 7 points that I put together here. But I think they're very basic. This is the way that I see them, as being very basic.
mhm. And I guess, is there any of the other seven you'd want to kind of highlight or emphasize that we haven't already discussed here?
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, well, must be loyal to the country's constitution and abide by its provisions, even to his or her own disadvantage. Now, this is something that, um, I've seen here in Canada as well. Our former Prime Minister Stephen Harper was a conservative, a large C conservative. We have conservative, liberal, and New Democratic parties. The New Democratic Party is a kind of democratic socialist party here in Canada. Stephen Harper, I sometimes had the sense that if he could completely incapacitate the opposition, he would do it.
Yeah.
And I've gotten that impression with other leaders as well. So it's not just an American phenomenon. It's not it's something that we might actually associate with with a country in the less developed world. What's
Yeah.
sometimes known as the third world. But here in Canada, at least, and this is something that goes back to Great Britain and to England, there's this tradition of government and His Majesty's loyal opposition.
Yeah.
So the opposition is limited, but has limited power, but is authorized to audit the government in power to
Hmm.
ensure that they live up to what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Now, in the United States, we don't have exactly the same thing as government and opposition, but there is a sense in which a party that is not in the White House uh, needs to function in the same way as an opposition party would
Yeah.
in a Westminster constitutional democracy, such as we have here in Canada, Australia, or the United Kingdom. So during Ronald Reagan's first term, I think it was probably Thomas P. O'Neill, Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, a Democrat, that functioned in some ways like a leader of the opposition, and was able
Hmm.
to challenge the Republicans, or at that time it was a kind of a coalition of Republicans and Southern Democrats who were more conservative than some of their more liberal um, uh, fellow partisans, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in that respect, I think that like 1980 to 1982, 81 to 83, I should say, functioned a little bit like a Westminster style parliamentary democracy in some respects.
Yeah. Yeah. What else would you say? So that was
Yeah,
number three. They must not abuse the office to
yeah,
advance personal, financial, or other interests.
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Must
that
on.
brings up a whole notion of corruption.
Hmm.
Corruption is when people um, in leadership use the power that they have to enrich themselves, or in other ways to earn advantages for themselves or um, their friends, if you will, their
Hmm.
cohorts.
Yeah.
Vladimir Putin is a very wealthy man.
Yeah.
Where did all that wealth come from? Well, I wonder.
Yeah.
I wonder.
He
And there
exploited
are
the
people.
system. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And again, because that sense, the rule of law, and the sense of opposition to corruption is not very deeply seated in the Russian political culture, there was nobody really to stand in his way, except for a few people with conscientious Russian would-be leaders, who were such a small number that Putin could, imprison them or bump them off, get them out of the way in some fashion.
Yeah.
But that's important. We don't want to have corrupt politics.
Hmm.
Here in Canada, the whole public service, the whole, what we might call bureaucracy, is made up of people that are appointed according to the merit principle.
Yeah.
In the United States, prior to 1883, there was something called the spoil system, whereby a political leader would come to power, a president would come to power, fire all the previous office holders in the bureaucracy, and then hire his own cohorts. That's
Yeah.
something that Andrew Jackson brought in.
Mm.
To,
And
to, to,
it's something Trump is saying he wants to do when he comes into office again.
that's what it
Yeah.
sounds like. Yes, that's what
Yeah.
it sounds like. In the American bureaucracy, about the top 10% of the what might be called the administrative state is still made up of political appointees.
Yeah.
So there are always hundreds of offices to be filled when a president comes to office. But
Yeah.
below that level, the administrators, bureaucrats, if you will, that's sort of a negative term, are protected by the merit principle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which
And I
means
do.
that yeah,
Yeah. I was gonna say
that means.
yeah.
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead. You go
There's a
ahead.
bit of a lag here. I think
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
is when
No.
we're talking, but yeah. It means that they have to submit to competitive examinations. They have to be interviewed for the job, and on the basis of their ability to do the job, then they are hired.
Yeah.
That's what the merit principle is.
Yeah. And I think that's important. And the way I see things are unfolding is that we're sort of transitioning from merit to, I don't know if spoils is the word I would use, but the thing I was thinking of is more of like personality cult. So it's around a person that is sort of our allegiances to that person, and it's not to the merit. And what I mean by that is if they win or lose, it doesn't matter. My commitment is to that person, whether they win or lose.
That's
and that
right.
seems like a very toxic thing.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and that's I think I think what we're seeing right now is that there's a kind of Napoleonic style of politics, not just in the United States right now, but we can see that in Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro. We can see that in Hungary under Viktor Orban's and his Fidesz party. But, everybody knows Orban, less about the party that supports him. Vladimir Putin is certainly a kind of strongman political leader, and and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands right now seems to be in that kind of a position as well. So and it's not healthy, but I will say that there is something more attractive about a person than there is an abstract document or a set of principles. So this is one of the things that I think Canadians have an advantage with respect to constitutional monarchy.
Yeah.
When I became a citizen of Canada 30 years ago, I took an oath of allegiance to the Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs, and her successors. Now the Queen, I with my American birth, I was not born a subject of the Queen. At least I don't think I was. My father was a British subject at the time that I was born, so I may have been. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But, I grew up in the United States, to the republic for which it stands, and so forth. But I think there's also something about a person, who embodies the political community in the way that the Queen did exceptionally well during the 70 years that she was on the throne. To such a degree that when she died 2 years ago, I found myself quite heartbroken. I found myself weeping for days afterwards, which I surprised myself.
Yeah.
But I think that it's I just got my first coin the other day with King Charles on the front of it. And there's something about that. King Charles, it's his face that occurs on our coins,
Yeah.
not Justin Trudeau, our current prime minister, not Stephen Harper, our former prime minister, or Pierre Trudeau, our current prime
Yeah.
minister's father. Those people stay off of our coinage and off of our currency, and
Yeah.
and I think for very good reason. For very
Yeah.
good reason. Yeah.
Well, and I do wonder if that symbolic
Yeah.
influencer could be a part of the part of the American system that could be added,
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
constitutional amendment of sorts.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think a couple of years ago, Joe Biden made a speech. I think it was a needed speech in many respects about MAGA Republicans and the threat to the constitutional order. The trouble with that speech is that his very office and the fact that it's a political office means that about half the country will simply not listen to him because they say,
Hmm.
well, he's a partisan political figure, which he is.
Yeah.
In the run up to German unification in 1989, 1990, Germany has a system. They have a chancellor who's counterpart to a prime minister in Canada or Great Britain. There's also a Bundespräsident, a state president. He is above partisan politics. He's not elected by the people. But in the run up to unification, the Bundespräsident, the federal president at that time, made a series of speeches to allay the fears of Germany's neighbors that a
Hmm.
reunited Germany would start to have designs on its neighbors' territories.
Yeah.
Because twice in the 20th century, that's exactly what happened. So the
Yeah.
state president, not being a partisan political figure, not a Christian Democrat, not a social democrat, not a free Democrat or a Bavarian
Yeah.
Christian socialist, he was able to make those kind of speeches and be heard because he was embodying the nation in a way that the Chancellor Helmut Kohl at the time simply could not
Yeah.
do because of the nature of his office. And that's something that Americans are missing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. The one thing that comes to mind is I almost feel like it falls on the people to sort of push for that or not.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
maybe that's a weird backwards way of doing it.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know. It's interesting because in the late 19th century, after the American Civil War, there was a series of ineffectual presidents, and
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily using that in a negative way, but the presidents between um, Andrew Johnson and right up until William McKinley were fairly weak figures, to such a degree that Woodrow Wilson, who had
Mhm.
become president after the turn of the century, in the middle of the 1880s, he was a political science student. He's the only academic political scientist to become president of the United States. But he wrote a book called Congressional Government, in which he believed that the United States was moving towards a British-style parliamentary system, in
Mm.
which the president would be more like the monarch, Queen Victoria
Yeah.
at the time, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives would be like a de facto prime minister
Hmm.
because it was the Speaker of the House in the last um, about a quarter, maybe a little bit longer, of the 19th century that was functioning as driving the business of the country through
Yeah.
Congress, with the
Mm.
president basically staying aloof from normal political affairs.
Yeah.
And all of that took
Yeah.
place without changing the document at all. It's called
It
the
was just a
Constitution of the
shift.
United States.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Well, the other thing so number 7 is I think is a really
yeah,
interesting one. It's must be generous and charitable to opponents and supporters alike. And I
yeah,
think it's hard to know how much that is a cause versus an effect.
yeah,
But when that one starts to deteriorate,
yeah.
um, it's a sign that something is really wrong. Because, and I think as a Christian, I think it's even more so because we're supposed to love our enemies, and if I'm treating my enemies viciously and wrongly and lying about them, like as a Christian, that's a problem, you know.
And I think one man, a president of the United States, who really exemplified that seventh point about being charitable towards opponents was the first George Bush, George
Mm,
H.W. Bush.
yeah.
I think he was probably, among the best presidents of the second half of the 20th century. He only served for one term. Um, he came to office, but when he was defeated by Bill Clinton, he was very gracious towards him, gave him
Yeah.
I think it was a tour of the White House, but
Yeah.
told him, well, this is where you're going to work. I'm
Yeah.
turning this over to you. Just a very gracious
Yeah.
gentleman, who
Yeah.
really exemplified the kind of leadership
Hmm.
um, skills that I
Yeah.
think every leader ought to have.
Hmm.
Just
Yeah. I think, and
a
yeah,
tremendous person. Yeah,
and John McCain comes to mind as another example. I can
that's right.
recall
Yeah,
several rallies where
yeah,
people were talking badly about Obama, and he actually stood up for Obama
that's right.
in
Yeah,
those situations.
yeah, 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 that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So there is something about this list that I think, as a standard, is both clarifying and convicting.
Yeah.
When you say, "Hey, this is what our leaders need to be," all of a sudden now it's in a sense, it's a judge, right? I mean, how am I faring? So what are your thoughts about just clarifying these things and how it
Yeah.
applies? And part of me wonders, it's one of those things where if someone gets taught it before 2016, before these things happen, then it helps. But now people are already sort of locked into their thing. It's like they don't want to hear this. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that's right. As I said, I'm not sure that I came up with exactly this list before the events of January 6th in 2021. But I think these are things that out of 30 years of teaching political science, I think these are things that were in my head, but they
Yeah.
may have been articulated in other ways in the classroom and perhaps in
Yeah.
writing and in my books and so forth. But I think if we could put together a list like this and give them to every member of Congress, for example,
Oh yeah.
or every governor of the states of the several states, and I'm thinking of that because generally presidents of the United States come out of Congress, or else they were formerly governors of one of
Hmm.
the states,
Yeah.
and presumably they would get experience with leadership in these areas. But of course, there are some people. Well, Trump would be a good example of somebody who had no political experience whatsoever before he came to the White House,
Yeah.
and I think that's not a particularly good thing. I think we should want our political leaders, in whatever country we live in, we should want our political leaders to get the experience that they need, because with experience tends to come wisdom.
Yeah.
And you may have all of these ideological illusions. I'm going to refer to my first book in that way. These ideals that you want to accomplish, but if you don't have the experience to recognize how those ideals might be limited and how
Yeah.
your own sight might be limited as well, your own
Hmm.
vision might be limited.
Yeah.
That's not going to do you very well. Dwight Eisenhower was another really great president. I know that a lot of people, when I was much younger, dissed Eisenhower as being kind of a, do nothing president. But as a matter of fact, he presided over an era of relative peace in the United States in terms of military power. Being a military man himself, he understood the limits of military power in a way that his successors did not during Vietnam, for example.
Yeah.
I find it very doubtful that Eisenhower would have gotten the United States heavily involved in a quagmire like Vietnam. And he
Yeah.
was smart enough to be able to get out of Korea and to come up with a way of not ending the war but having a ceasefire,
Yeah.
which has held for 70 years now.
Yeah.
And when the war had become unpopular, and he realized that he could not maintain the American commitment
Yeah.
to the Korean Peninsula for much longer. So as soon as he came into office, he negotiated an end to the war. It takes
Hmm.
a lot of wisdom. It takes somebody who recognizes the limits
Yeah.
of power in a way that Eisenhower did.
Yeah.
Again, an exemplary leader.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Something I wish we had options, like that now.
I know.
Um,
Yeah,
so someone that might look at your list, obviously in
yeah,
your post, you're kind of focusing on Trump, but someone who is in support of Trump might go, well, Biden falls short of these as well.
yeah.
And I think
That's right.
you sort of acknowledge that, and no one's going to be perfect in following all of them.
No, no, that's
But
right.
what would
Yeah,
you say to that person? What's the difference, between someone
yeah,
that's falling short and Trump?
yeah. I think I think Biden has made efforts to try to reach out to his opponents in a way that Trump does not seem to think is in any way important.
Yeah.
And I think that's a key difference. I've
Hmm.
I've had a lot of disagreements with Biden. I think he has made some very unwise statements, well-intended statements, but I think very unwise statements in terms of foreign policy, for example.
Hmm.
Making commitments which or saying that America is committed to such and such when and people wonder, whoa, when did we make that commitment?
Yeah.
Just things like that. It may be a byproduct of his age. I don't want to diss a man because of his age. I'm getting up there myself. Um, but I think it's one has to at least make the effort to reach out to people who are political opponents.
Hmm.
And if you don't think that's even necessary, if you're just going to um, drive the wedge even further into the divide, that's not going to help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so is that kind of the crux of the matter, is the divisiveness? Biden's at least attempting, or at least if you were critical, at
Yeah.
least giving the facade of it, and Trump doesn't even care about that.
Well, I think that's true. Yeah, and I think most leaders, presidents, will at least have that facade.
Yeah.
Even if they're bitterly opposed to their um, to the opposition candidate, they'll at least in public be try to be gracious, even
Yeah.
if they don't feel it in their heart.
Yeah.
And you may say, well, is it better to be sincere, right? It's get to, but I honestly don't think so. I think if you're giving up any kind of civility in terms of your communication with other people, that's not a good thing.
Yeah.
If even if you believe that that the dress that your neighbor is wearing is ugly. You don't tell her that to her face. That's just
Yeah.
not a good thing to do. You try to come up with other things to talk about that you have in common, and that
Yeah.
shouldn't be that difficult.
Yeah.
Political opponents. I can almost certainly come up with people on both the progressive and the conservative sides of of political, the political aisle, if you will. I could probably come up with things that I would share with both sides that I think are
Hmm.
important to emphasize.
Yeah.
So, look for co-belligerents, look for people that you can fight the battles with, recognizing
Hmm.
that when it comes to a certain point, you will not be able to go along with them any further. But
Yeah.
that's just part of the political process, the political game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's I kind of think of the idea of, in terms of an argument, like steel manning versus straw manning. And if I am only straw manning my opponents, and I don't
Yeah.
even know the steel man argument, like that's a signal that something's off, that something's wrong.
That's right. Yeah.
And I maybe become an extremist. I may become hyper
Yeah.
partisan, and
Yeah.
that's something I see as sort of a red flag, right?
Yeah. Well, that's right. Absolutely. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you want to be very fair to your opponents. Um, if somebody, is I wish there was more of this on the two sides of the abortion issue as well. I myself am pro-life.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think I would want to say, if I were in political office myself, or more heavily involved than I am in the day-to-day business of politics, then I think I would want to say, well, what is it that you're looking for? People who are on the pro-choice side. What is it that you're trying to protect, and what are you uneasy about? And I think there are ways to reach across the aisle and to try to come up with compromises that may not satisfy both sides completely, but at least we'll be able to say, okay, these are things that we value
Hmm.
alike.
Yeah.
And we can, even despite our differences, we might be able to come up with something that we can, if not exactly agree with fully, at least live with for the time being, while working for long-term
Yeah.
change.
Yeah, that's a good point. I have a friend who is
Yeah.
I'm on the pro life side, and he's on the pro choice
Yeah.
side. But he told me, he said, if pro life people were to address all the issues that cause people to have an abortion, he'd be much more receptive to their point of view.
That's
And
right.
so I think that's an example of like, oh, hey, we're on different sides, but we can come to an agreement where we're both moving towards the vision, and we're not losing, and creating that division.
I think so. That's right. Yeah, and it
Yeah.
maybe the pro-lifers would have to be satisfied with a regulation regime, as they
Yeah.
have in European countries.
Mm, yeah.
Here in Canada, we have no abortion law whatsoever. The
Mm,
Supreme Court of Canada struck down the old Section 251 of the Canadian Criminal Code in 1988, which was the old abortion law. The government of Brian Mulroney attempted to enact an abortion law, which died in the Senate, the upper chamber of the Canadian Parliament in 1991. Since that time, nobody has wanted to touch that. There
yeah.
were many Christians who said, "Well, this law doesn't prohibit abortion, therefore we're going to oppose it."
Yeah.
But in opposing it, they ended up giving a regime in which there is no law covering abortion at any stage of pregnancy. Now, it's
Yeah.
not to say that there are late-term abortions. I think they're very rare in Canada.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the same time, by not being open to the possibility of regulation, then they ended up losing the whole game.
Yeah. And I think I do
Yeah,
wonder if that's going to be the case in some states in America, because
yeah,
you're going to have some states that are going to have actually looser laws than others,
yeah.
that compared to the federal overturning. But that kind of brings us to the next question, which is
Okay.
about policy.
Yeah,
And I think some people would make the argument, well, your list is great and all, but this person, I don't agree with their policy, so I'm going to vote for the guy who violates your list because he at least has my favorite policy. So how would you what would you say to those people that are more partisan and policy oriented?
yeah. That's a tough one, and honestly, that's one that I've not been successful in talking to people about because honestly, I think these criteria should be applicable to both parties. They should
Mm-hmm.
be applicable clear across the board. But if a person, in some ways, I think the Democrats, um, in facing off against Trump and his Republican supporters, have not been terribly wise because somebody like a Joe Biden, when he came to office, should probably have said, "I am now president, but because of the divisiveness in the American body politic, I will not view my mandate, which was a narrow mandate, as a ticket to go full steam ahead on a kind of progressive agenda, as it were,
Yeah.
because I recognize that many Americans are not on side. So I'm going to be very careful in the policies that I pursue
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that I will keep as many people who might be disaffected Republicans on side, and that's not something that he's done.
Yeah.
You know, his 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 Trump's predecessor, Barack Obama, made all the right noises in 2008. He's American presidents have to be both king and prime minister,
Yeah.
and it's a rare president that can pull off both. Barack Obama and Michelle Obama, they were like king and queen. They have almost the regal bearing, and like John and Jackie Kennedy,
Mm.
60 some years ago now. They're kind of, they have kingly personas. But and Obama, once he came to office, began to pursue a full-on progressive agenda, including taking the Little Sisters of the Poor to court
Yeah.
over the contraceptive mandate. It's just a very foolish thing to do.
Yeah.
So whereas if Obama had said, my mandate is to be a president for all the people,
Mm-hmm.
therefore I'm not going to pursue a mandate that will further divide the people.
Yeah.
And he didn't do that, unfortunately. Sad to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I guess in that sense, what I think the argument you're making is like we've slowly deteriorated, and now we've hit a point where now it's just very explicit and unmasked. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, that is right. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So I think the other layer that I'd want to ask you about is, as a Christian and looking at my
yeah,
fellow Christians, a large portion of them sort of swarmed around this man
yeah,
who, from my point of view of the 7 items, kind of violates them. But as a character and as a Christian, it's I feel like it's even worse than that. And
yeah,
yet they've sort of given him their allegiance. I mean,
yeah.
what do you make of that? And what are your thoughts about it?
Well, I have a friend that's written a book. Caleb Campbell. He's written a book called Disarming Leviathan,
Yeah.
and it's just come out. I think that I have a copy of the book, but I think it's actually the release date I think is early next month. I think it's
Okay.
on the 4th of
Oh,
July,
okay.
as a matter of
Oh,
fact.
okay.
So yes,
Cool.
so I would advise people to look at that because he has dealt with this notion as a pastor of a church in the American Southwest. You know
Yeah.
what happens if your parishioners are allied with a divisive political figure. You know how do you get through to people? How do you
Hmm.
reach out to such people? And I think he's taken a quite good approach. So I would recommend people to get a copy of that book. Caleb Campbell is his name, and the
Okay.
book is called Disarming Leviathan, also
Yeah.
published by InterVarsity Press,
Oh, okay. Cool.
which is my publisher as well.
Yeah.
And I think very highly of them, and they're publishing some
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
fantastic books.
Yeah. And so I mean, I think there's kind of a spectrum. There's some Trump supporters on one end that are like, he's
Yeah,
selfish, he's terrible, but I have to vote for him anyways because I'm a
yeah, that's right.
Republican
Yeah,
or because the Democrats are so
yeah,
evil. And then you have the
yeah,
other side, which is like, oh, Trump is wonderful. He never lies. He's a
yeah,
righteous, wonderful man. And you kind of have everything in between.
yeah.
Um, but they all have their reasons, right? We all have our reasons
That's
why
right.
we do things.
That's right.
And
Yeah,
I guess it is messy. It is complex. Um, and we have our emotional layers and our moral layers. I mean, what would you be your sort of guiding wisdom for us, and maybe to be honest about how we
yeah.
vote and how we approach this?
Right, right. I actually have some advice from on those along those lines in my next book that's coming out
Yeah.
in November,
Okay.
Citizenship Without Illusions. And I think that one of the things we have to do is just keep the lines of communication open. I even have
Yeah.
advice towards the end of one of the chapters about, a fellow member of your church who you know is going to be voting differently than you. Sit down with that person over coffee or whatever, and just uh, what is it that you look for in a political leader, as opposed to what I'm looking forward to. And I think what we may find is that different Christians vote different ways. I think I used to be harder on Christians doing that at one time. I still wish that there were a political party, that was neither Republican nor Democrats, in the United States,
Yeah.
that was at least open to some kind of a Christian worldview.
Hmm.
If not an overtly Christian political party, and I'm going to make a case for that in my forthcoming book. There is a party called the American Solidarity Party that's trying to fill this kind of a gap,
Yeah.
and I think pay attention to them. I think they're going
Yeah.
to have to start at the local level and try to build up from there if they want to have staying power.
Hmm.
But in the meantime, people will vote different ways, and typically, given the electoral system that we have in our English-speaking democracies, generally what we end up doing is voting for the party or the candidate we think will do the least harm.
Yeah.
So I can't say that I have ever voted with enthusiasm. One of the sections of one of my chapters in this next book is called "Holding Your Nose."
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and I guess the concern I have about that, or some people use sort of the voting, the lesser of two evils kind
yeah,
of
that's right.
idea. I think I have a couple of problems with that. Is that if you're voting for the lesser of two evils, and the reason I like your list, if you're voting for the lesser of two evils, you're spiraling downward,
Right.
and because you're always going the lesser, but then you're not actually, you're telling the parties, hey, we'll vote for a horrible person if as long as they're not as horrible as him or her. And I also think it gives nefarious actors like a blueprint. Oh, here's how I exploit them. If I say this, I support this policy, and I do this, I can get their support, and then I can go maybe rake in money, whatever my personal motivation is. But what I like about your list is it creates an ideal to move towards versus sort of the less worse option. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, the way that the system is set up. It's almost structurally the case that voters have to vote for the party they object to least.
Yeah.
So because we have it's called a first past the post electoral system. Basically, the
Hmm.
electoral college functions in a similar way for the president of the United States, and there's always the option of voting for a minor party. I've done that. I've done that myself. Voted for a minor party.
Yeah.
They won't get any vote. They won't get any seats in Congress. They'll never get to the White House, at least under the current system. But I'm in this next book as well. I make a plea for electoral reform, such that existing parties that are coming to be um, dysfunctional can fade away.
Yeah, they can
Because
die
our
without
system
killing us all.
artificially, that's right, our system artificially props up the two major parties.
Hmm.
In the Netherlands right now, the old the Christian Democratic Union, which was a descendant of Abraham Kuyper's anti-revolutionary party that was started in 1879, it now seems to be in the process of fading away
Yeah.
because Dutch voters seem to have decided that it no longer has a place in Dutch
Hmm.
politics.
Yeah.
I think that's a shame in some ways, but the electoral system that's based on proportional representation allows that to happen. Parties
Yeah.
come and they can go. In the
Yeah.
United States, the Democrats and the Republicans have been locked in place artificially for the last 160 years.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
is that some of that have to do with sort of the winner take all type of system? Is
exactly.
that kind of what you're talking about, reform?
Exactly.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Or even like I'm in favor of. I like the idea of the ranked based ranked based voting, where you kind of
Yeah,
pick your option in order of priority, and then it distributes the votes accordingly.
that's right.
So it's,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a ranked choice.
ranked
That
choice.
you
Yeah.
could use that for like a president. You could use that for a governor of a state or a
Hmm.
mayor or something along those lines. Or else short of that, you could have a French-style runoff election.
Yeah.
That's there are going to be
It,
elections in France now, coming
yeah.
up. Yeah,
So in that sense, it's almost like some of our systems are almost too simplistic. They need to sort of address the
yeah.
complexity of our realities in a way.
Well, it's true. I mean, the American system was made for a very small, federal republic, clinging to the eastern seaboard of North America, and in the 18th century. And in many respects, in most respects, the United States is not the country that it was 200 some years ago.
Yeah.
It's vastly different. But in some ways, the system that's enshrined in the document has not kept up with the realities on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
It's like we've got a lot of, I don't know, societal debt, system debt that we've got to
yeah,
kind of work out.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So what are some other, I mean, that's some examples of kind of how do you improve it. What are some other ideas you have to improve the system? Obviously that doesn't necessarily fix
yeah,
it
right.
this year, but I feel like
No,
after we
no,
survive 2024, like there does have to be some changes and new
I think
things
so.
and
Yeah, yeah,
reforms. What do some of those look like?
yeah. Um, I mean, one of the things that I've believed for a long time is that it would be good to extend the term of a representative, a member of the House of Representatives, from 2 to 4 years, because 2 years, 2 years is way too short a time for a political leader to be able to make hard choices. There has to be some time between elections. You don't want to have um, uh, office holders who are running for election half the time. It would be better to space that out so that they
Mm,
could make the hard decisions that need to be made in between election times.
without fear of losing their job. Yeah.
Exactly, that's right. I mean, and we know that here in Canada as well. We have elections about every 4 years. It could be less than that if there's a
Yeah.
minority government. I don't want to have to explain all that, but it's it could be 2 or 3 years, but generally it's 4 years.
Yeah.
And then when they're coming up against that 4 year statutory limit, because then they start saying, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to give that
Yeah.
to you, and so it's like they're trying to bribe Canadians to vote for them,
Yeah.
and governments and political parties do that, at election time. You don't want to have that happening too much. So
Yeah.
space out the elections. I think in the House of Representatives, I think that would be a great thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What else? Any other ideas you want to throw out there for
Um,
reforms or changes in the political parties, perhaps, versus
yeah. Oh, yeah.
the
Yeah.
overall
Well,
system?
I think the way that the parties nominate their candidates, I think, is severely broken.
Yeah.
Um, Prior to 1968, the party conventions would actually decide who would be the candidate, the
Hmm.
standard bearer for their particular party. So in 1952, there was Dwight Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, who was not really associated with a political party before that, but he was running for the Republicans at that point. And then his principal opponent was Robert Taft, who was more of an isolationist.
Yeah.
Wanted to withdraw the United States from world affairs and so forth. The convention actually had to decide, the Republican convention, who would be the candidate. Which meant that prior to the convention, there would be not just primary elections, but there would be local officials, state officials, city officials, municipal officials within the party who would vet the candidate to make sure that this was a qualified candidate.
That they adhere to your 7 things, right?
Yeah. Like Mayor Daley, of Chicago, Richard J. Daley of Chicago, 1955 to 1976, he was mayor of Chicago. He was one of these kingmakers in the Democratic Party. Kennedy, Johnson, these were people that Mayor Daley was supporting. Now, he was corrupt as anything. I think we all recognize that now. And but at the same time, there was something right about having an actual official, a Democratic Party official who was elected by the people, making decisions, vetting candidates for the highest office in the land. That all changed after 1968. It's become so thoroughly democratized, supposedly. Now the people decide who's going to be a presidential candidate, but the people are not. They're not a responsible agent. It encourages Napoleonic politics. You can have a leader that says, "I don't care what Congress says. I don't care what the courts say. I have the people behind me." And it encourages Napoleonic politics. And I think that the U.S. Constitution, in the empirical sense, is now dangerously off balance.
And I think in your book, Political Illusions, you talk about the ideology of democratism. The sort of this as sort of the maybe the other side being the republic, and the republic representative republic versus sort of a democracy, and and having a balance of the two, not being overly democratic but not being overly representative. Right. Is that you want to hear me?
That's right. And this goes back a long ways. This goes back about 2,500 years. There was a Greek historian by the name of Polybios who believed that the strength of Rome was its balance of its various institutions. It was a balance between monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And from then on, virtually every political philosopher into the modern age, and things changed with Hobbes and Rousseau and so forth, but up until that point, everybody believed that a mixed constitution that would be a combination of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy would be the best form of government, more durable than one of these pure forms, because monarchy, if unchecked by other elements, would degenerate into tyranny. Aristocracy would degenerate into mere oligarchy, in which you would have the few simply running the polity in their own interest. And this is what the founders of the United States, and I venture to say that Canada's fathers of the Confederation, understood this as well. That the best system is a kind of combination in which you would have you would have democracy, aristocratic elements, monarchical elements, balancing each other out. It's not quite the same as the checks and balances that Americans extol, but it's very closely related.
So something's out of whack, and
it is.
Until we fix it, we're probably in for a car crash somewhere in our future, or another
That's
one.
my fear. That's my fear, and as living in Canada now, I can see that Canadians are going down this route too, which I'm not happy about.
Like America's pioneering it, and everyone's following suit.
Exactly, that's right. I mean, Canada is we're kind of a cross between United Kingdom and the United States in many of our political institutions, but unfortunately, we're not taking the best of those. Unfortunately.
So what? Okay, we're in this. It's only June. right? The election's in
That's right.
November.
Yeah.
It's going to get
Yeah.
wild these next several months. So
Yeah.
what's your advice and wisdom for us as we navigate the next several months, and how we
Yeah.
vote and how we interact with those in our lives?
Yeah. Yeah. Whatever you do in your ordinary life, try not to exacerbate the divisions that are already present. And I would
Yeah,
say pray hard. Pray hard.
yeah,
My next book, the last chapter, is about prayer in the church, and I think we have to pray,
yeah,
along with our fellow Christians, and pray with our fellow believers who who disagree with us on the political choices that we're making. Pray
yeah,
with them,
yeah,
and I think if you're praying with somebody or for somebody, you can't hate that person.
yeah. That's a good point.
And yeah, and I think we need to do more of that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And so that brings up the idea of you can't hate them. And so is that a big
exactly.
part
That's
of
right.
the issue, is our contempt and hatred for our fellow Americans?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's gotten worse in the. I left. I've not lived in the country since the 1980s, and it's gotten worse since then. And it really it pains me to see that.
yeah,
I mean, I'm living outside the United States, but at times I find myself almost in tears as I think
hmm,
about what's happening there.
yeah.
And yeah,
And it feels, for me, if the grief of it is that the division and the separateness and the brokenness, the grief of it is the contrast of what it could have been in terms of the
right.
unity and the working together and the solving
Yeah,
problems and thriving as a community. And
that's right.
instead we're
Yeah,
all participating by throwing Molotov cocktails into the situation.
that's right. And I think the internet and the social media have only exacerbated these tendencies.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's a tragedy. And I
it
think, to your
is.
point about the prayer, though, God redeems the tragic, and so our prayer is that he he already has that in mind for whatever tragedies are unfolding and continue to
Right.
unfold,
Right.
that the redemption is and the resurrection is on the other side of that, right?
Exactly. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So before we wrap up, you do have this upcoming book that you've mentioned a few times. You
Yeah,
want to talk a
that's
little
right.
bit more about it? If people are interested, they might want to pre-order it. So tell us what this is,
Yeah,
and
sure.
yeah,
Yeah, when I wrote my first book, Political Visions and Illusions, the first edition came out 21 years ago. The second edition came out 5 years ago, substantially updated from the first to the second edition.
yeah,
Um, there were people that read it, and people thought, wow, this just blew me away reading
yeah,
this. And I've had that response from a number of people, and they'd
hmm
say, well, what do I do with all of this? How do I, you've convinced me that the various ideologies that are afoot, liberalism, socialism, conservatism, democratism, which is a word, I don't think I invented that word, but I don't think your spell checks will be able to recognize it. Nationalism, they're persuaded that these really are forms of idolatry.
yeah,
But then they say, but what do we do now? Because our political parties are dominated by these. How do I vote intelligently? How do I get involved in ways? And so this next book is going to try to help people to find their way through that. And
mm,
to be honest, I'll give you a bit of a clue. I don't think voting is the most important way that you can act
yeah,
as a citizen.
yeah,
And I found myself in this book focusing more than I had thought I would when I first started writing this more on local action.
yeah,
Yeah, rather than focusing on state or
hmm
provincial or federal action. And in some ways, I think your local community, that's where you will be able to see the results of
hmm
your efforts.
yeah.
You
And
won't
we have a
see
lot
it on the
more
map.
control or
Yeah,
authority or
absolutely.
ability.
That's
Yeah,
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. That's right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
So
citizenship without illusion.
that's right. Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. That's the title. Yeah, and it will be it's due out on the 26th of November. My editor tells me just yesterday that if you pre-order it on, from IVP, you can also pre-order it on the standard vendors like Amazon, Barnes and
hmm
Noble, and so forth. That you may have it in your hands before the official release date.
Cool.
So,
Yeah,
I would encourage you to pre-order it as soon as
yeah.
possible.
So it's really an actionable guide. Okay, I
Yeah,
agree with
that's
your
right.
premise and political visions and
Yeah,
illusions. I want to figure out how to act. And
that's right.
this new book is more tactical. It sounds like.
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. Yeah, more practical in its focus.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, David, thank you so much for sharing your insights and wisdom, and we appreciate it.
You're very welcome, Jason. It's good to talk to you.
Yeah, sounds good.